How do you hope the war in Ukraine comes to an end? And what's the path, once again, to minimizing human suffering there?
Well, I think that what is likely to happen, which is really pretty much the way it is that something very close to the current lines will be how a ceasefire or truce happens. But you just have a situation right now where whoever goes on the offensive will suffer casualties at several times the rate of whoever's on the defense. Because you've got defense in depth, you've got minefields, trenches, anti-tank defenses. Nobody has air superiority because the anti-aircraft missiles are really far better than the aircraft. Like, there are far more of them. And so neither side has air superiority. Tanks are basically death traps, just slow moving, and they're not immune to anti-tank weapons. So you really just have long range artillery and infantry trenches. It's World War I all over again with drones. Throwing little drones, some drones there,
which makes the long range artillery just that much more accurate and better, and so more efficient at murdering people on both sides.
Yeah. So it's whoever is. You don't want to be trying to advance from either side, because the probability of dying is incredibly high. So in order to overcome defense in depth trenches and minefields, you really need significant local superiority in numbers. Ideally combined arms, where you do a fast attack with aircraft, a concentrated number of tanks, and a lot of people. That's the only way you're going to punch through a line. And then you're going to punch through and then not have reinforcements just kick you right out again. I mean, I really recommend people read World War I warfare in detail. It's rough. I mean, the sheer number of people that died there was mind-boggling.
And it's almost impossible to imagine the end of it that doesn't look like almost exactly like the beginning, in terms of what land belongs to who and so on. But on the other side of a lot of human suffering, death,
yes,
and destruction of infrastructure.
Yes. I mean, the thing that the reason I proposed some sort of truce or peace a year ago was because I predicted pretty much exactly what would happen, which is a lot of people dying for basically almost no changes in land, and the loss of the flower of Ukrainian and Russian youth. And we should have some sympathy for the Russian boys as well as the Ukrainian boys, because the Russian boys didn't ask to be on the front line; they have to be. So, there's a lot of sons not coming back to their parents, and I think most of them don't really have. They don't hate the other side. It's sort of like, there's this saying about, like, this saying comes from World War I. It's like young boys who don't know each other killing each other on behalf of old men that do know each other. The hell's the point of that?
So Volodymyr Zelensky said that he's not, or has said in the past, he's not interested in talking to Putin directly. Do you think he should sit down, man to man, leader to leader, and negotiate peace?
Look, I think I would just recommend, do not send the flower of Ukrainian youth to die in trenches. Whether he talks to Putin or not, just don't do that. Whoever goes on the offensive will lose massive numbers of people. And history will not look kindly upon them.
You've spoken honestly about the possibility of war between U.S. and China in the long term, if no diplomatic solution is found. For example, on the question of Taiwan and one China policy.
Right.
How do we avoid the trajectory where these two superpowers clash?
Well, it's worth reading that book on the difficult to pronounce Thucydides trap, I believe it's called. I love war history. I like inside out and backwards. There's hardly a battle I haven't read about. And trying to figure out like what really was the cause of victory in any particular case, as opposed to what one side or another claimed was the reason.
Both the victory and what sparked the war and
Yeah.
the whole thing.
Yeah. So that Athens and Sparta is a classic case. The thing about the Greeks is they really wrote down a lot of stuff. They loved writing. There are lots of interesting things that happen in many parts of the world, but people just didn't write it down. So we don't know what happened, or they didn't really write in detail. They just would say like, we had a battle and we won. And like, well, what? Can you add a bit more? The Greeks, they really wrote a lot. They were very articulate on it. They just love writing. So, and we have a bunch of that writing that's preserved. So we know what led up to the Peloponnesian War between the Spartan and Athenian alliance. And we know that they saw it coming. I mean, the Spartans didn't write. They also weren't very verbose by their nature, but they did write. But they weren't very verbose. They were terse. But the Athenians and the other Greeks wrote a lot, and they were like, and Sparta was really kind of like the leader of Greece. But Athens grew stronger and stronger with each passing year, and everyone's like, well, it's inevitable that there's going to be a clash between Athens and Sparta. Well, how do we avoid that? And they saw it coming and they still could not avoid it. So, at some point, if one group, one civilization or country or whatever exceeds another, sort of like if, the United States has been the biggest kid on the block since I think around 1890 from an economic standpoint. So the United States has been the most powerful economic engine in the world longer than anyone's been alive. And the foundation of war is economics. So now we have a situation in the case of China where the economy is likely to be 2, perhaps 3 times larger than that of the U.S. So imagine you're the biggest kid on the block for as long as anyone can remember, and suddenly a kid comes along who's twice your size.
So we see it coming.
Yeah.
How is it possible to stop? Is there let me throw something out there, just intermixing of cultures, understanding. There does seem to be a giant cultural gap in understanding of each other. And you're an interesting case study because you are an American, obviously. You've done a lot of incredible manufacture here in the United States, but you also work with China.
I've spent a lot of time in China and met with the leadership many times.
Maybe a good question to ask is, what are some things about China that people don't understand, positive, just in the culture? What's some interesting things that you've learned about the Chinese?
Well, the sheer number of really smart, hardworking people in China is incredible. There are really, if you say like, how many smart, hardworking people are there in China? There's far more of them there than there are here, I think, in my opinion. And they've got a lot of energy. So, I mean, the architecture in China that's in recent years is far more impressive than the U.S. I mean, the train stations, the buildings, the high-speed rail, everything. It's really far more impressive than what we have in the U.S. I mean, I recommend somebody just go to Shanghai and Beijing, look at the buildings, and go to, take the train from Beijing to Xi'an, where you have the terracotta warriors. China's got an incredible history, very long history. And, I think arguably in terms of the use of language from a written standpoint, sort of one of the oldest, perhaps the oldest written language. And then China, people did write things down. So now China historically has always been but with rare exception, been internally focused. They have not been acquisitive. They've fought each other. There have been many, many civil wars. In the Three Kingdoms War, I believe they lost about 70% of their population. So they've had brutal internal wars, like civil wars that make the U.S. Civil War look small by comparison. I think it's important to appreciate that China is not monolithic. We sort of think of like China as this sort of one entity of one mind, and this is definitely not the case. From what I've seen, and I think most people who understand China would agree, that people in China think about China 10 times more than they think about anything outside of China.